Welcome to Simplified UPSC by PPP, where we listen, learn, and grow together. Detailed lecture notes in English and Hindi, plus practice questions for prelims and mains, only on our Telegram channel. Link in description. Like and subscribe for more.
Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we are undertaking a really critical mission, building a solid foundation, conceptually and factually, around India's protected area network. This whole system, it isn't just some list of nice places. It's actually the core legal and biological framework for in situ conservation. That means, well, saving species right there in their natural homes. Understanding this structure is, frankly, key to grasping India's entire environmental approach.
Absolutely. And to build that foundation, we really have to start with the legal roots, the whole protected area structure. It rests on one single really historic law, the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, the WPA. You see, this act came about because of a crisis, a real disaster, actually, the huge decline in India's wildlife back in the mid-20th century. It gave the central and state governments this, well, unprecedented power to legally fence off habitats. It shifted conservation from just being a policy idea to a hard legal requirement.
Okay, so the WPA 1972, that's the bedrock, the legal authority for the government to actually create these zones. So, our task today feels twofold. First, we need to carefully unpack the specific types of protected areas the WPA defines, the legal tools, you could say. And second, we need to broaden our view a bit, understand the bigger picture, the administrative and even global frameworks like Project Tiger and Biosphere Reserves that sort of sit on top of or work alongside the WPA.
Right. And before we dive into those legal definitions, let's just ground ourselves geographically and biologically, too, because the whole point of the WPA is protecting life that's native to India. Our sources really highlight several key species found naturally here that depend on this network. Think about the star tortoise or the highly threatened monitor lizard and the pygmy hog. We should keep these species in mind. They remind us what's at stake. It's a sharp contrast, isn't it, to something like the spider monkey, which the source explicitly says is not native, so not a target for this protection system.
That's a really important clarification right at the start. Endemism versus non-native. Okay, let's get into the legal stuff. So when a state government looks at an area and thinks, right, this needs protection, the process isn't exactly straightforward, is it? It involves quite a complex legal procedure. Can you walk us through how a piece of land actually becomes a legally defined protected area?
It's definitely designed to be careful and, importantly, to deal with human concerns right from the start. It begins with what's called the initial notification. The state government basically announces, through the official gazette, its intention to make an area either a sanctuary or a national park. And this intention, it has to be justified. Based on the area's ecological significance, its fauna, flora, geomorphology, natural beauty, or zoological importance. It's not arbitrary. There are scientific criteria. And this can apply to land both inside or outside existing reserve forests.
Okay, so the initial notification is just the first step, the government signaling, we're thinking about this. This must then kick off the really tricky part, dealing with existing rights, claims, how people are already using that land. What happens next?
That's exactly when the legal side engages directly with the local people. The law requires a specific period for people to come forward with their claims. The chief wildlife warden, or sometimes a specially appointed officer, often called the claims officer or collector, starts investigating. They have to determine the existence, the nature, and the extent of any rights anyone might have in or over that land. And these rights can be incredibly varied, rights to use forest produce, that's usufruct rights, grazing rights for cattle, collecting firewood, minor forest produce, sometimes even actual property rights.
Right. This rights settlement phase sounds absolutely crucial and probably the most likely point of conflict in the whole thing. What does it actually mean operationally to settle these rights? Does the government just kick people out, or are there specific ways to handle these claims?
Well, it's complex. Settling a right means first acknowledging it exists. Then the government has to decide whether to acquire it, extinguish it, or perhaps allow it to continue, but under very strict rules. This depends heavily on whether it's going to be a sanctuary or a national park. We'll get to that difference. If the government decides to extinguish the right, it typically involves compensation, maybe relocating people, or offering land elsewhere outside the protected area. The law is really meticulous here, because if these rights aren't properly settled and recorded, the final protected status could be legally challenged down the line. It's only after this claim period ends and the claims officer has finalized the record of rights that the state government can issue the final notification. That final notification officially sets the exact boundaries and declares the area a sanctuary or national park from a specific date.
Okay, so that painstaking, often lengthy process is there to make sure human rights and land issues are addressed before the full weight of conservation protection comes down.
Exactly. And once that final notification is gazetted, the protection is legally solid. Unauthorized entry residing there is strictly restricted. The law is clear. No one can enter or live in a sanctuary or national park without a permit from the chief wildlife warden. But we do need to remember those 5 key exceptions.
Oh, yes, the exceptions. Remind us.
Right. You're allowed entry if you're a public servant on duty, someone explicitly permitted to live there, someone who actually owns immovable property within the boundaries, their dependents, or, importantly, someone just passing through on a defined public highway that happens to run through the area.
Those exceptions really show that constant balancing act between absolute protection and, well, practical legal necessities. Okay, now let's get to the heart of it. The 2 main categories under the WPA, national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. How does the law actually distinguish between them in practice?
They basically represent a scale, a gradient of protection, and how much human activity is allowed. A national park, NP, signifies the absolute highest level of protection under the WPA. The concept is a true wilderness area, maintained solely for wildlife and its environment. The really stringent rule here is that all rights of any people living inside the designated area must be completely settled and extinguished. This means the NP becomes, effectively, entirely government land. As a result, activities like letting livestock graze, that's strictly prohibited. No grazing inside a national park, period.
So the national park is essentially the hard line, conservation first, pretty much requiring the removal of almost all human interaction and existing rights. How does the wildlife sanctuary, WLS, compare then? Is it just a weaker version?
Not weaker, necessarily, but definitely more flexible from an administrative standpoint. A wildlife sanctuary still provides vital protection, but it allows for certain pre-existing rights of people to be allowed and regulated, rather than needing to be completely extinguished. That's the critical difference, you see. It gives the state government the ability to manage human activities, like allowing or regulating grazing, for instance, without totally undermining the conservation goal. WLS often serves as a necessary conservation space where maybe some level of community needs has to be accommodated, but under very controlled conditions.
I want to zero in on that practical difference. If you're managing one of these areas, the label NP or WLS really dictates your day-to-day job, doesn't it? Like managing a national park sounds like mostly enforcement, policing the absolute ban on things, whereas managing a wildlife sanctuary seems more about negotiation, setting the terms of access, making sure regulated use doesn't harm the wildlife.
That's a very good way to put it. The WLS allows for, say, communities that depend on the forest for minor produce collection to potentially continue under rules, whereas in an NP, that would likely be stopped entirely.
So WLS balances conservation with some limited regulated human presence. NP aims for absolute preservation, minimizing human interference.
That's the core conceptual difference, yes.
And this need for, well, more flexibility and maybe more community involvement, it seems to have led to newer categories being added later on, right? Recognizing that strict MPs and WLSs can't just be islands. We're talking about the post-2003 amendment additions.
Correct. The 2003 Amendment Act brought in the Conservation Reserve, CR. Now, a CR is declared in areas that are owned by the state government and are usually adjacent to or connect existing national parks and sanctuaries. Their purpose is very specific, very strategic. They act as buffers or corridors or connectivity zones. They're meant to protect the wider landscape, the seascape, or habitat, making sure those core protected areas aren't just isolated fragments.
That structural role sounds vital, turning isolated patches into a functional network. But how is the management set up? Especially if they're buffering core zones, you need local cooperation, right? How do you ensure that?
Well, the management structure itself demands participation. Conservation reserves are managed through a specific body called a Conservation Reserve Management Committee. The very existence of these committees is an acknowledgement that effective wildlife management often needs to look beyond the strict boundaries of an NP or WLS. It requires consulting and collaborating with the local communities living nearby. It shows a shift in thinking towards landscape-level conservation and inner.
Okay, so we've got the strict statutory base, NP and WLS under the WPA. But often when people think of Indian conservation, they think of these huge mission-focused projects. Project Tiger is the big one. How does that fit in? Is it another WPA category?
That's a really critical point of clarification. Tiger reserves are not technically a separate legal category under the Wildlife Protection Act itself. They're areas often encompassing existing national parks, sanctuaries, or parts of them that are specifically notified for protecting the tiger, its prey animals, and its habitat. They operate under the administrative umbrella of Project Tiger, which, as you know, launched way back in 1973.
Right, and Project Tiger's big innovation, administratively speaking, was that core and buffer zone strategy. How does that work in practice, and how does it align with the WPA definitions we just discussed?
The Tiger Reserve uses this two-zone approach for different management intensities. You have the core zone. This part is legally required to be kept absolutely undisturbed. Conservation is the absolute priority here. It often aligns very closely with the idea of a national park, sometimes even being officially declared a critical tiger habitat under the WPA.
Yeah.
Minimum human interference. Then you have the buffer zone. This surrounds the core and is designed for multiple uses. Here, land use that's compatible with conservation is allowed. So things like regulated forestry, well-managed ecotourism, some limited human activity, they can happen as long as they support the integrity of the core zone. It acts like a shock absorber, basically.
And given the immense pressure on these tiger reserves, political pressure, development pressure, what makes their protection so strong? What stops them from just being, denotified when convenient?
That protection comes from a very powerful centralized body,
Mm-hmm.
the National Tiger Conservation Authority, NTCA. The NTCA became a statutory body in 2006. It provides top-level oversight and enforcement power. The law is extremely specific here. A state government can denotify a tiger reserve, but only if it's deemed absolutely necessary in the public interest. And this is crucial only with the prior explicit approval of both the NTCA and the National Board for Wildlife. That's a very high bar. It makes the protection for tiger reserves incredibly robust, reflecting just how important they are considered national.
That strong central oversight really matters, doesn't it? It's probably why the data on tiger numbers is so closely watched. When we see those estimates go up, like from around 1411 in 2006 to 1706 in 2010, it seems like a direct result of this focused high scrutiny approach.
It certainly plays a major role. And tigers aren't the only focus like this. We also have the framework for elephant reserves. These are administered under Project Elephant. Their goal is similar: protect viable populations of wild elephants, their habitats, crucial migration corridors. A big focus there is also on minimizing human-elephant conflict, which is a huge issue, and providing the conservation structure needed for these large, wide-ranging animals.
Okay, shifting gears slightly to the global context, we have Biosphere Reserves, BRs. Now, these seem fundamentally different from the WPA categories, partly because they're recognized internationally under UNESCO's MAN and the Biosphere program, right? They're not just about protection, but also about sustainable development.
Precisely. The Indian government started its National Biosphere Reserve program back in 1986. The main aim of a BR isn't just fencing off nature. It's about testing and demonstrating ways that conservation and sustainable development can actually work together on a large landscape scale. The emphasis is much more on reconciliation than pure exclusion.
And how is that reconciliation actually built into their structure? It must need a different kind of management plan than a standard national park.
It absolutely does. It mandates a three-zone structure, which clearly shows that gradient of human interaction we talked about. First, you have the core zone. This is very similar to a national park in its strictness. It has to be legally protected, kept absolutely undisturbed, and contain good habitat for important species, maybe endemic ones or top predators.
Yeah.
Only research that doesn't manipulate the environment is allowed here.
Okay, core is strict. Then you move outwards to the buffer zone. What happens there?
The buffer zone surrounds or sits next to the core. This area is used for research that might be more experimental. It's also where things like environmental education, training programs, and carefully managed low-impact ecotourism happen. It sort of manages the human pressure right next to the core zone.
And finally, the outermost layer, the transition zone. This sounds like where the real reconciliation mission of the BR comes into play.
Yes, exactly. The transition zone is the zone of cooperation. This is where you find human settlements, agriculture, other economic activities, and sustainable resource use happening. The focus here is very much on finding ways to mitigate conflicts between humans and wildlife, promoting sustainable livelihoods, and doing all this with the active participation and involvement of the local communities. This whole layered design of the BR, it's an internationally recognized way of acknowledging that maybe the future of conservation isn't just about keeping people out, but about finding ways to partner with them for economic and social development that actually supports ecological goals.
And that approach makes sense given India's huge diversity, both ecologically and culturally. It's why India is considered one of the world's mega-diversity regions, right? This complex tapestry needs complex solutions, right? We need to connect all this legal structure back to some concrete examples, especially the key species and places mentioned in the source material. Let's start with coastal and aquatic areas. They often need slightly different tools because they're so dynamic.
Coastal protection is definitely complex. India's PA network does include specific coastal protected areas, MPAs. The source mentions 4 national parks, 96 sanctuaries, and 3 marine biosphere reserves designated under the WPA. But often the broader protection of the coastal zone itself comes under a different law, the Environment Protection Act of 1986, specifically through the Coastal Regulation Zone, CRZ notifications.
And within those CRZI rules, the CRZI zones are the most sensitive ecologically. What kind of restrictions apply there? What's banned to protect them?
In CRZI areas, think mangroves, coral reefs, salt marshes, areas critical for tidal flow basically, new construction is prohibited, full stop. The aim is to prevent habitat destruction and pollution. There are only very specific strategic exceptions allowed, things related to the Department of Atomic Energy, laying essential pipelines or transmission lines, and installing vital weather radar systems, like for cyclone warnings. It shows a balancing act protecting the coast generally, while allowing for critical national infrastructure or safety needs.
Got it. Now, what about some specific species that rely on these aquatic and coastal systems? The source mentions a couple of key reptiles.
Yes, for the Gharial, that very distinctive long-snouted crocodilian, highly endangered, its best remaining natural habitat is the Chambal River. That river system is crucial for its survival. And for the India softshell turtle, its primary habitat is noted as the Ganges River. Again, highlighting the importance of these major riverine ecosystems as protected corridors.
Okay, and moving offshore to the islands, there's that unique primate, the crab-eating macaque. Where do we find that?
Right, the crab-eating macaque has a very limited distribution in India. It's found only on Nicobar Island specifically. The source mentions Little Nicobar and Great Nicobar. It lives in various coastal habitats there, from mangroves and swamp forests, right up to nearby farmland, apparently up to about 600 meters elevation.
All right, let's turn inland to some terrestrial flagship species. The pygmy hog is a really good example to link legal protection with the actual threats on the ground.
Definitely. The pygmy hog is one of India's most critically endangered mammals. It's now restricted to just one single remaining population, located in the Manas Wildlife Sanctuary in Assam. And this really highlights a key point. Just being inside a wildlife sanctuary isn't always enough if the habitat itself is being degraded. The main threats listed are the massive loss of its crucial alluvial grassland habitat, the annual practice of burning these grasslands in the dry season, which destroys cover and food, and uncontrolled grazing by livestock.
So protection needs active habitat management too. Okay, another key primate, this time from the Western Ghats, the lion-tailed macaque. Where are its main strongholds?
The lion-tailed macaque, it's endemic to the rainforests of the Western Ghats. Specifically, it's found across the 3 southern states, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Karnataka.
And for higher altitude ecosystems, there's the Kashmir stag, also known as the Hengal. Where is its habitat?
The Kashmir stag, or Hengal, is actually a subspecies of red deer found only in India. Its main range is the dense riverine forests, the high valleys and mountains of the Kashmir Valley, and also in northern Chamba in Himachal Pradesh. Its fairly restricted habitat makes it very vulnerable.
Okay, finally, let's just quickly pinpoint a couple of the famous protected areas mentioned specifically in the source material.
Sure. Keoladeo National Park in Rajasthan, world famous, especially for its incredible bird life. It's a major wintering site for migratory birds, historically including the Siberian crane, though they are rarely seen now. And another important one mentioned, particularly for the Northeast, is Pygmy Wildlife Sanctuary. That's located in Arunachal Pradesh.
Right. And before we wrap up the factual side and move to management, we have to mention sacred groves. These aren't statutory PAs under the WPA, but their protection can be incredibly strong, can't it?
Oh, absolutely. Sacred groves are amazing examples of conservation driven entirely by local communities and beliefs. They're patches of forest protected because of religious significance, may be seen as the home of a deity. This belief often leads to incredibly strict protection, acting as natural repositories for biodiversity. The source mentions the Garo and Kazi tribes, for instance, where sometimes any interference is forbidden, even collecting dead leaves. It's conservation enforced by culture, often predating any government laws.
Okay, let's really nail down the most important conceptual difference for listeners. We've talked about the notification process, the exceptions for entry. But if you had to boil down the fundamental operational difference between a national park and a wildlife sanctuary, especially regarding land and human rights, what are the absolute key points?
Right, the core distinction really comes down to how severely the law impacts the local people and their existing rights. I'd say there are three main things. One, the protection level. It's just higher, more uncompromising in a national park. The goal is pristine wilderness. A wildlife sanctuary allows conservation to be achieved more through regulating activities rather than banning them outright. Two, right settlement. This is the absolute bedrock difference. In an NP, the law demands that all pre-existing rights of people within the boundaries must be settled, usually meaning extinguished. The land becomes fully government domain. In a WLS, however, certain rights can be allowed to continue, provided they are recognized and strictly regulated by the chief wildlife warden so they don't harm wildlife or habitat. And three, allowed activities. This follows directly from the right settlement. Activities that have a major environmental impact, like grazing livestock, are absolutely strictly prohibited in a national park, no exceptions. But in a wildlife sanctuary, grazing can be regulated, maybe limited to specific zones or seasons, and permitted under those rules.
That lays it out very clearly. The WLS is conservation with community flexibility. The MP is conservation, largely without ongoing community rights inside.
Okay, but even with this tiered system, the whole protected area network faces huge challenges on the ground, doesn't it? What are the main problems undermining this legal framework in practice?
Yes, the source material points to several major challenges. Probably the most immediate and visible one is human-wildlife conflict, HWC. This is that inevitable clash when the needs of wildlife, like elephants needing space, tigers needing prey, herbivores needing grazing, overlap with areas where people live and farm. What drives it? Things like relentless human population growth, converting natural land for farming or roads or settlements, and habitats getting broken up, forcing animals into closer contact with villages. The result? Costs on both sides, tragic loss of human life sometimes, crop damage, livestock losses, and then often, sadly, retaliatory killing of wildlife.
Right. And alongside that direct conflict, there's the constant pressure from resource use and just general degradation, which legal protection doesn't always stop. Exactly. You see significant encroachment and anthropogenic pressure. The source mentions mining activities near forest areas, even if they're just outside the boundary. They lead to deforestation, soil erosion, pollution, which inevitably impacts the protected area, especially buffer zones. In coastal areas, the problem might be the unregulated dumping of sewage or industrial waste into estuaries and coastal waters. This chemically degrades critical marine habitats, even if they're legally protected zones like CRZI.
And we also touched upon those internal biological threats earlier, things like invasive species, disease outbreaks, or just declining habitat quality, like we saw with the pygmy hog example.
Yes, those are often more insidious threats. For many endemic species, the danger isn't just direct conflict, but the slow degradation of their specific habitat needs. The loss of those alluvial grasslands and the dry season burning in manas that directly hits the pygmy hog's survival chances. So management can't just be about patrolling boundaries. It has to be dynamic, tackling invasive plants, monitoring water sources, adapting to changes. That requires ongoing scientific input and active intervention.
So summing up those challenges, it shows the WPA structure, while vital, isn't enough on its own. It needs constant active management, and critically, it needs ways to integrate local economic realities.
Right.
Which brings us back to those cooperative models we discussed.
Precisely. You can almost see the design of the Biosphere Reserves, the core buffer transition structure, as the management response to these challenges. It formally recognizes the need for reconciliation. Sustainable management in the long run seems to require these innovative approaches, things like promoting ecotourism in buffer zones, where the benefits actually flow back to local communities, developing better mechanisms for conflict mitigation, providing alternative livelihoods so people aren't solely dependent on extracting resources from core forest areas. The BR structure is almost a blueprint for tackling the challenges seen across the entire network. #tag Matisse sounds. Conclusion and final provocation.
Well, we have definitely done a deep dive today into India's conservation backbone. We started right at the legal core, with the stringent definitions under the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. We clearly marked the difference between the absolute preservation goal of national parks and the regulated coexistence possible in wildlife sanctuaries.
Right. And then we layered on top of that, moving outwards, we looked at the strategic role of conservation reserves as corridors, the powerful central authority of the NTCA overseeing tiger reserves, and that global cooperation model seen in UNESCO's 3-zone biosphere reserves. And we tried to anchor all that legal complexity with some hard facts, remembering the specific habitats of the Gharial, the pygmy hog, the hangul, and the importance of places like Kildare.
I think the key takeaway for you, the listener, is really recognizing this gradient. India's conservation strategy isn't monolithic. It's a carefully layered legal and administrative system. It moves from strictly protected core zones towards areas that actively try to involve human partnerships. It reflects that constant, necessary tension between protecting biodiversity and accommodating human development.
Understanding that gradient, and particularly those fundamental legal differences that dictate how management works on the ground, especially that crucial difference between extinguishing rights in an NP versus regulating them in a WLS, that's really key to grasping the whole policy landscape.
Which brings us neatly to our final provocative thought for you to mull over. If conservation success really does hinge increasingly on effective community participation, as suggested by the creation of conservation reserves and the whole philosophy behind Biosphere Reserves, then how effectively can a fundamentally top-down, centralized legal framework like the WPA truly empower the Gram Sabha? Remember, the Gram Sabha is the elected village authority, the body designated under the Forest Rights Act of 2006 to actually initiate and settle forest rights claims. Can the WPA structure truly allow them to be equal, decision-making partners in managing this vast conservation network? Or does the strictness of the WPA inherently create friction with the spirit of local stewardship embedded in the FRA? That tension between centralized conservation law and decentralized community rights and empowerment, that remains perhaps the most fascinating and critical challenge for the future.
A really profound point to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep digging into the details.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Telegram and Instagram. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.